Welcome back. Okay, so our fifth panel, is that fifth? Yes, I do have the right one. Sorry. Panel 5 on military and policy challenges. So we have 4 speakers with us from my left all the way to the end of the table. First, we have my dear colleague and friend, Sarah-Myriam Martin-Brûlé, who is professor at Bishop University and non-resident fellow at the International Peace Institute in New York. She's also, with me, a deputy director of the Centre FrancoPaix. In 2018-19, she was the Canada Fulbright Research Chair for Peace and War Studies. In 2021, she was awarded the 3M National Teaching Fellowship. Her research focuses on peacekeeping intelligence, peace operations, and security issues related to intrastate wars. And she is the author of the first UN guidelines on gender and peacekeeping intelligence. She is also co-author of the first United Nations Field Handbook on Joint Mission Analysis Centers. Thank you for being here, Sarah. Then we have Dr. Allison Brown, who leads the climate security effort for the U.S. Army Climate Directorate. She, working in the Office of Installation, Energy, and Environment, Dr. Brown supports climate efforts, including integration, literacy, and wargaming. She supports the Army Climate Directorate from her position as Climate Security Policy Advisor at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Her background includes policy work from her position at the United Nations Agency for International Development, USAID, and rigorous science, chemistry, and physics associated with solar energy conversion from her PhD at Michigan State University and postdoctoral work, at Uppsala University. Welcome. Then we have Dr. Dhanasree Jayaram, assistant professor at the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations and coordinator at the Center of Climate Studies at the Manipal Academy of Higher Education in India. She is also a research fellow at the Earth System Governance Alliance and a member of the Climate Security Expert Network. Dhanasree areas of research include environmental and climate security, climate diplomacy, environmental geopolitics in Southern Asia, Indo-Pacific, and polar regions. She also works on gender and climate governance and geopolitical and security implications of solar engineering. She is the author of Breaking Out of the Greenhouse, Indian Leadership in Times of Environmental Change, and Climate Diplomacy and Emerging Economies, India as a Case Study, and we'll welcome her back to our conference at Montreal. Very happy to see you again. And then, of course, Simon. We've heard from him. We'll hear from him again today. Welcome back, Simon. A professor emeritus at Wilfrid Laurier University Fellow at the Balsillie School of International Affairs, Senior Fellow at Center for CG, or Center for International Governance and Innovation, and a Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Global Studies at the University of Victoria. So I'll ask everyone to speak for about 12 minutes. 12-15 at the very most, but please aim for 12 minutes so we have a lunch, and before that, our period question. So, Sarah-Myriam?
Thank you so much. I will make up for the time that I didn't monitor properly for the first panel. So Bruno said it, I'm mostly coming from a United Nations perspective and experience and expertise in a sense. So my intervention will really focus on that setup. It will focus on military and policy challenges related to intelligence and climate change. And of course, intelligence is a highly sovereign matter. And climate change is by essence a transnational issue, which impacts, of course, both national and international security. But more drastic climatic events occur domestically and impacts population abroad and at home. And of course, it creates repercussion everywhere. And as the effects of climate change are being felt more drastically, both domestically and in the international realm, national intelligence agencies are, of course, increasingly integrating climate change in their own work. And similarly, for international organizations such as the United Nations, climate change has more visible and graspable effects on the theater of operations, mainly of peacekeeping operations. Climate change has an impact on conflict and crisis that the organization is, of course, set to tackle, address, and even prevent. And climate change has an impact on the very means of interventions and preventions in these conflict and crises. But to remind everyone, intelligence is a tool, right? Intelligence is a tool for decision maker to receive the best information to support and guide their actions. So 3 challenges I want to address today in relations to intelligence as a tool to better inform decision makers, and decision makers then take decisions. So 3 challenges with regards to intelligence as a tool are, and its relation with climate change. One challenge is the challenge of sharing information between states and non-state actors. The second challenge that climate change poses is the question of the burden sharing of actionable intelligence. So once you have the intelligence, who is to act, how and when, and how to address and prevent the scenarios that are put forward. And the third challenge is related to the actual will to act, right, of who benefits from what and when. So with regards to the first challenge, one of the biggest challenge in intelligence and in sharing the information is not so much the sensitivity or the content of the information itself, but rather what you reveal by sharing intelligence of what you know, right? So the sensitivity often lies not so much in the information shared, but rather in what states are willing to disclose about their intelligence gathering capabilities. So sharing information on climate change entails a twofold challenge. What information to share with other states, and how and to the extent to which the information intelligence shares reveal intelligence sources, method, and collection capabilities, namely in terms of climate change and predictability. And the second challenge is what information to share with non-state actors, for example, with this partnership with private companies with different technological capabilities. So sharing of information is then followed by an additional issue. Once share, who owns the information? So there's this first set of challenges that I want to put there and that we can discuss afterwards. The second challenge is a question of the burden sharing, right? Who is to act upon this information? Climate change issue, we say that we transcend borders. So by essence, climate change is a collective problem. Hence, once information is shared, who is to take action, at what cost, and within which scope of action, right? How to find mutual interests, geopolitical priorities, which balances the priorities of national decision makers in the short and long term as well. And that brings me to the third challenge of incentives and benefits. In certain settings, and for some actors, climate change can create favorable conditions to maximize one's gains. And this may impede the very will to tackle sources and even the effect of climate change, and especially in theaters of operations in which peace operations occur. Right, climate change effects, and it has been mentioned, I'm sure, yesterday, and it's common knowledge. It can increase droughts. It can increase resource scarcity. But droughts, resource scarcity can be exploited by groups to enhance their control over the remaining resources. It can be used to boost recruitment. It can be used to control the movements of population. And this has been the case in theaters just like Mali in Central African Republic, in South Sudan, and in Iraq, in which, for example, transhumance routes were used either to conflate or even enhance conflict between herders, pastoralists as well. It can create to, of course, worsen existing conflicts triggered by increasing disparities, spawning new disputes, and stoking on intercommunal strifes as well. It can also be used to ascertain control over the remaining resources, control over migration routes as well. And it can also create governance problems, which can then be exploited by criminal networks, who then benefit from having those lack of projection of power from the capital to more remote areas. So increasing invisibility, in a sense, of criminal networks and enhancing profitability of those networks as well. Also, there's a question of states that may also use the effects of climate change to request additional international support, financial or technological help as well. States may also benefit temporarily from changes related to climate change, and states may also refuse to adopt solutions which would undermine their own source of revenues. And examples would be, for example, mining. How do you control mining where it's a big source of revenues? And I'm thinking about how much some states, let's say like DRC, for example, can benefit from mining industries, and how do you control the climate effects or environmental footprints of those extractive industries when it's the main sources of your revenues? So because of those three challenges of sharing information, burden sharing, and will to act, I think these are the three challenges I want to highlight for this panel on military and policy challenges. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruno. Before I start, I want to say thank you to you and to all the organizers of the workshop for some wonderful topics and conversations, both yesterday and today. So I'm Allison Brown, and for those who don't know me, I am a climate security analyst, and I'm on the the climate security analysis and translation team at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Prior to starting at the lab, I was at the United States Agency for International Development. At USAID, I dealt with climate change and environmental and social impact in several operating units, including Africa, humanitarian assistance, and conflict. Before my time at USAID, I was educated in the hard sciences of chemistry and physics with my PhD and postdoctoral research focused on renewable energy and electricity production through solar energy conversion. And while that may sound nerdy, I don't bring it up gratuitously. I bring it up to highlight the perch from which I, not representing anyone else at this moment, come to the issue of climate security from a combined lens of physical data and human experience. Now, to Katie's point, that does not make me a climate security expert, but this perspective does lend itself to gap bridging. And as we've heard during several previous talks and conversations, there are a few needs for translations and modification as we operationalize climate security. One of them is coordination across and between sectoral concentrations. There seems to be a consensus in this room that climate security is a topic that spans, affects, requires, and weaves together multitudes of sectors. Research on climate security in one place or sector might, and often does, look very different than climate security research in another place or sector. To Katie's point also, we need to have specific, localized, and comprehensively context-relevant data to understand the climate security issues and responses at play. Another gap is from academic to operational. So once Katie has been able to study every possible locale, and Alex has been able to run every possible set of variables to come up with every possible future, and Cullen has been able to apply every appropriate theory to explain those futures, and Nicholas has been able to embed and enact every possible policy, we still only have words on the page. Now, don't get me wrong, the words are a huge accomplishment, but those words cannot be said directly to every commanding officer and with the assumption that every officer will go and do. There is still the need to operationalize. Operationalizing a concept takes literacy. Literacy takes training. Training takes hiring staff, developing process and content, applying the content to the relevant situation, and more. The point being that moving from the discovery to the application is difficult and time-consuming, even when the concept is simple or agreed upon, and climate security is anything but. A third gap is from information provision to absorption. As scientists, we collect data. We write papers, and each paper has at least one point, hopefully. As practitioners, we read papers, and we may even understand the point intended. But that does not mean we appropriately combine the points of two papers. It may be that Noémie considers each conclusion independently without them connecting them. It may be that Lloyd and Lindsay combine these conclusions, but in different ways. Or it may be that Simon is so overwhelmed with writing his two papers that he looks at all the titles of the papers and decides they are not relevant to him. Or maybe they are relevant, but he doesn't have time to read them. As we attempt to combine sectoral concentrations and as we work to operationalize the brilliant findings we uncover, we should avoid assuming that information is the same as communication or understanding. So that is a bit about me, Allison. Now, from that perch, I spend half of my time embedded in the U.S. Army, in the Army Climate Directorate. And I will focus the rest of my talk on the progress the Army has made in climate security, as well as some challenges with which it continues to contend. As has been mentioned a few times already, the impacts of a changing climate are felt globally. The U.S. Army has faced costs and damages from increases in extreme weather events to Army, people, and property. Last July, just 5 hours south of here, the U.S. Military Academy was flooded by a torrential rain of 8 inches or 20 centimeters. It overwhelmed bridges, infrastructure, and roads. Damages are estimated to be north of $100 million US. This January, on the other side of the world, a series of unpredicted gigantic waves hit the island of Roy Namur, a major part of the Ronald Reagan ballistic missile defense test site, resulting in significant inundation and facility damages. Repairs are estimated to take months to years. This is money and time nobody wants to spend this way. This brings us to a topic that has had some spotlight this week: prioritization. Installations need to be able to support their mission, and this takes money. Modernized equipment needs to be reliable in the field. This needs time for testing. Disasters at home and abroad need responders, and this requires people. A world of finite resources is a world in which trade-offs are the reality. Sometimes there is no opportunity to ask for more money, and often the technology that they want to use is not mature enough. So they have to decide: pay for the upgrade now, or wait until the next improvement is available. With this in mind, I'm going to talk through how the U.S. Army has positioned itself for climate action. The executive order released by the White House in January 2021 on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad catalyzed thinking and action in our national security community at the outset of the Biden administration. The Defense Department responded with a climate adaptation plan and national defense strategy as part of a White House-led strategy to respond to climate security implications, summarized as the resilience of communities coupled with the stability of nations in a changing climate. The 2022 National Defense Strategy recognized the importance of climate change in altering the security environment in which Department of Defense operates, acknowledged climate as among its defense priorities, highlighted that the Department of Defense will support climate resilience of allies and partners, and flags the roles of climate in force planning and readiness. It emphasized the building enduring advantages through more resilient and energy-efficient operations and incorporation of climate in wider threat assessments and planning. It also stated that climate change will affect security relationships with allies, partners, and adversaries alike. Insecurity and instability related to climate change may tax governance capacity in some countries, while heightening tensions between others, risking new armed conflicts, and providing new leverage points for non-state actors and increasing demands for humanitarian assistance and stabilization activities. With these foundational guidance documents developed, the Army produced a climate strategy that took on clear and achievable goals. Those goals are: achieve 50% reduction in Army net GHG pollution by 2030 compared to the 2005 levels. Second is attain net zero Army GHG emissions by 2050. And proactively consider the security implications of climate change in strategy, planning, acquisition, supply chain, and programming documents and processes. These goals were operationalized through 3 lines of effort. The first line of effort focused on installations. They claimed enhance resilience and sustainability by adapting infrastructure and natural environments to climate change risks, securing access to training and testing lands into the future, and mitigating global greenhouse gas emissions. They have accomplished this in 3 different ways, through adapting military facilities and lands to withstand increasingly challenging conditions and deploying advanced technologies to strengthen the ability to rapidly recover from disruptions to public infrastructure. An example of this is in fiscal year 23. The Army developed 7 installation climate resilience plans to inform installation leaders and planners about short and long-term climate impacts, and to help inform how our installations and facilities will specifically mitigate or adapt to the effects of climate change. These plans pointed to and were supplemented by nature-based solutions, which reduced wildfire and flooding risks, stabilized permafrost, and improved at-risk species habitat at installations in the Kwajalein Atoll, Puerto Rico, and Alaska, as well as sites across the continental U.S. So a second way that it is meeting that first line of effort on installations is improving installation energy, environmental resilience, and water resilience for mission assurance. An example of this is the Army has pursued microgrids powered by solar power, coupled with battery energy storage systems. This includes a newly operational microgrid providing 26 megawatts of solar power to the grid daily. This system islands on-base power in the extent of an off-base power interruption and provides 100% energy resilience in the event of a grid outage. A third way that installations were supported were through the modernization of department operations to keep pace with industry. And an example of that is the U.S. Army is incorporating zero emissions and hybrid electric vehicles on its bases. Installations are adjusting to meet the future expectations of Army soldiers, families, civilians, and soldiers for life. The second line of effort associated with the climate strategy is acquisitions and logistics, which increased ground-based power generation operational capability while reducing sustainment demand, maintenance requirements, and strengthening climate resilience. An example of this is in October, the Army received a new turbine engine for flight testing. The Army expects this new engine to reduce fuel consumption by 25%, provide 50% increased shaft horsepower, decrease the maintenance burden by 30%, and achieve high hot operational capabilities. The last line of effort supported through the climate strategy is training, which means prepare a force that is ready to operate in a climate-altered world. This includes incorporating climate risks into war games, exercises, and other planning tools to identify vulnerabilities and remediate risks to operation plans. As we mentioned before, this requires literacy, and there is a very large climate literacy effort going on in the Army right now. And it also includes working with allies and partners, support for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and support to civil authorities. These lines of effort start in DC, but have filtered through each regional command center, with each region experiencing climate change and human responses differently. Here are a couple of examples of region-specific responses. The Indo-Pacific is home to several small island nation states that are particularly susceptible to the impacts of climate change. The resilience of our installations, partners, and allies in the region is particularly important in an increasingly contested logistics environment in this theater. Climate-related disruptions adversely affect partners and allies by exacerbating state fragility, fueling conflict, and contributing to large-scale instability and migration, creating conditions that state and non-state actors can exploit. The command in Europe is assessing long-term vulnerabilities posed by climate change to critical lines of communication. Aerial ports to debarkation, seaports of debarkation, and rail. And promoting technologies that reduce demands on local energy systems to build a more resilient and combat-capable defense posture. They also work with allies and partners to enhance the energy resilience of U.S. military bases in Europe, while encouraging the same energy conservation practices NATO has undertaken. As the U.S. Army begins to see progress towards the initially stated goals to mitigate and adapt to the first-order impacts of climate change, they are also considering second- and third-order impacts. For our purposes here, let's say first-order impacts of climate change are the results of altered timing, amount, form, or location of precipitation, heat, or storms, just to name a few. This could look like lower crop yields or different planting seasons, flooding and washing away of roads or bridges, changing animal migration routes and timing, overheating of buildings or bleaching of coral reefs. Second-order impacts then could be thought of as the human experience of or response of those first-order impacts. Briefly, this might look like the loss of income for a farmer whose crop yield was poor, decrease of nutrition for a family when food prices have increased, or it could look like adoption of new technology by someone who wants to decrease their carbon footprint. Because these responses are often the spark that starts the fire in a tinder-ridden context, as we talked about yesterday, these second-order impacts can become a security risk, and the U.S. Army needs to understand them. They can develop into conflicts to which the U.S. Army must respond, and they define the environment for the response. As climate change intensifies, the need for these responses will increase, and the cycle will perpetuate in the wrong direction. And now we're back to the trade-offs discussion. Response or preparation, reactive or proactive. In the perfect world, both can occur, but we are not in a perfect world. I will conclude with this thought and challenge. Many of us have mentioned the rarity of talking in such a like-minded group. Let's not be an echo chamber. I would challenge us to take on this impossible problem. Can we develop an actionable plan for militaries to respond to disasters whilst preventing more? If we cannot, while thinking about it and having all of the resources and understanding in this room, how can we expect one from those who are not? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Allison. Dhanasree?
Yep. I'll just start my stopwatch here. Thank you so much, Bruno and his team, first of all, for inviting me to be part of this conversation. And yeah, I've had a wonderful time listening to all the presentations so far. So my presentation or my talking points essentially will mostly focus on I wouldn't call it a region, but a geopolitical construct, which is the Indo-Pacific. And I think this is something that I haven't heard much mentioned here. From the part of the world where I am, Indo-Pacific is the thing. This is what everyone's discussing. And the only other speaker who mentioned Indo-Pacific is you, and that's not surprising either because you are from the United States. So I think that itself speaks about how we have such varied understandings and interpretations of what security interests are, whether it is hardcore security issues or climate security concerns. Just to briefly just speak about myself, I have been working on environmental security and climate security since 2012, if I can say, in India. And like Cullen mentioned yesterday, when I took up this topic for my PhD and for my project, a lot of people said, and especially in India, you also have to keep the context in mind. What are you going to do with this topic? But a lot, and I chose to work on the Indian military, which was even more, unconventional, at that point in time. But thankfully, I had a lot of supporters who did encourage me to stick to this topic. So climate security in that sense has evolved a lot since then in India and also the broader region of Southern Asia. And what I'm going to speak about today in the Indo-Pacific, which, as I said, it's a geopolitical construct which is imagined and constructed differently by different actors, depending on how you want to define the strategies. But for sure, most of the countries in the region or in this area have definitely come up with Indo-Pacific strategies, which all mention climate change, if not climate security, but climate change in various ways. And it's also interesting to see simultaneously, you also see countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia, and many others also and also, they release their national security strategies, and for the first time, especially Japan and South Korea as examples, do mention climate security in their national security strategies for the first time, very recently, which is kind of also aligned with the so-called Indo-Pacific strategy. A lot of it has to do with the Indo-Pacific strategy. So, I'm going to focus on what are the priorities and how these, how the policy challenges essentially come from how priorities are set. What are the kind of actors? Actors, primarily, I'm going to look on the military, little bit on the geopolitical entanglements, because essentially these are, influenced by the geopolitical dynamics in this region. And lastly, also the norms of engagement, which is, I think, very important to discuss. So first and foremost, when I look at climate security in, say, regions like South Asia, Southeast Asia, there's not much on conflict over there, So there's the literature or the policy analysis, they don't really focus on the conflict aspects. There's more focus on development priorities, livelihood losses, food security, water security, but again, water security in terms of access to water and not necessarily conflicts over water access. And I think that is very interesting to see how these perceptions against this conflict-centered discussion have developed, which is also a reason why many countries are not willing to also engage with, say, how the countries such as the United States or Canada or United Kingdom or many others are discussing, or European Union, how they discuss climate security does not really gel well with the discussions that are happening back home. And that is, as I said, the conflict-centered nature of these discussions do not really prevail in South Asia, Southeast Asia, where, as I said, the term security itself is, often seen like as comprehensive security, non-traditional security, and not necessarily something that is linked with conflict, which is, again, treated as a traditional sort of security concern. Whether it is environment-related or not, it doesn't matter. And that's, I think, an important distinction that is made. The second part which I wanted to highlight is that most of the countries in this geopolitical sort of, arena of Indo-Pacific are developing countries, least developed countries, and it's very important to highlight that many of these countries are going through this, term that you mentioned, Bruno, yesterday, the poly crisis, multiple crisis, or systemic crisis. It is already happening. And it has already started like a while ago, with debt crisis, energy crisis, climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, economic crisis. And we have seen many governments falling, and we have seen economic crisis leading to a situation where countries like Sri Lanka or Pakistan are still reeling under the pressure of, how to really come out of this economic breakdown that has happened. So in these kind of situations, climate change may not get prioritized, obviously, but also climate change, is usually seen through the systemic lens itself. That, if we are looking for, say, coming out of this economic breakdown, we also need climate finance to deal with our problems, something like that. Which is why climate finance becomes such an, this point of kind of complete fault line between the global north, global south, which is something that again comes up a lot in this particular context. So yes, when we say systemic crisis, yes, we need to sort of integrate climate change into all issues and all of that. But we also have to think of whether the actors really have the capacity to mainstream climate change and can really act on this, can really implement this. And we've been discussing the problems with implementation for the past 1.5 days. And especially in countries with less resources and less capacity, this becomes an even bigger challenge. I don't want to go into major issues, like, for instance, definitely resources and energy transition are critical to this region, because we are talking about, many rivers, that are transboundary rivers, which are affected by climate change and will, obviously show these geopolitical dynamics also act out there. But there are a lot of examples of cooperation as well. Many treaties that have been signed, which do not really show indicators of conflict. Even between India and Pakistan, the Indus River has never been a cause for conflict. There are many other geopolitical entanglements, but even during wartime, the treaty has remained intact. There's not been any sort of impact on the treaty itself, which is something I think we need to also highlight, that, conflict is not like the causal mechanisms may be very difficult to establish in all contexts. And that is also critical in discussions like, one of the points that Cullen mentioned yesterday about recruitment and how, does climate change and recruitment really match? There are some studies, especially in South Asia and Southern Asia, insurgency-affected areas, which do point to how the recruitment processes do increase in the insurgency-affected areas, especially after a flood. Especially when, these actors do fill the vacuum where the government is sort of absent, So yes, these mechanisms exist, but it's still very difficult to establish those causal mechanisms in all contexts. There are, of course, issues of climate migration and, energy transition as, critical minerals partnerships, which is something that, we've heard a lot in the past 1.5 days as well. And even in this, we have seen that, increasingly India, Australia, Japan, United States are forming these, like Quad, for instance, is one of them. I will come to Quad in a little bit. But the supply chain resilience initiative or, diversification of supply chains, particularly looking at China's dominance in this particular sector is something that is also being, looked at. Now, if we come to actors, which is another challenge, I think, especially looking at the military as an institution or actor in this context, and we know that there is already a lot of military-to-military cooperation happening, especially in the area of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. If you look at Quad itself, if you for people who don't know about the history of Quad, if you trace the origin of Quad, it goes back to the Indian Ocean tsunami, actually. That's when the initial sort of, conversations happened and the multinational effort to deal with the post-tsunami disaster relief was conducted. So since then, even if you look at the Quad, one of the areas in which there is some level of cooperation happening is on climate change. And Quad is considered a security definitely it's not an alliance, not a formal sort of setting either. There is a lot of informal sort of collaborations happening. But they have launched something called the QChamp, which is a climate change adaptation mitigation package. They have also launched the HADR principles. They are also looking at supply chains, de-risking, diversification, etc., etc. But there are also other examples like the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting, which also, ASEAN is the Southeast Asian Association, which also looks at, cooperation in these areas of disaster relief and many other issues. So the fact of the matter is there is already some existing cooperation mechanisms, but there are so many regional organizations and so many of these mechanisms, there is so less coordination between all of them, and that's a major challenge that again kind of, leads to a sort of stalemate in how these frameworks can be taken forward. The military is more or less, as I don't want to repeat it, but, a lot of what was already talked about impacts of climate change on military operations, effectiveness is something that is obviously prioritized over anything else, especially if you're looking at the Himalayan region, for instance, the Hindu Kush Himalaya region, heavily militarized. It's also one of the most ecologically fragile area. Climatically highly vulnerable. There is a lack of transboundary cooperation on climate change, whether it's between India, China, Pakistan, and even among the friendlier countries, there is a lack of cooperation, and hence there is also a lack of data because there is not much sharing of data or all those sort of activities which can actually increase cooperation is not happening to the extent it should, including on issues like glacial melting. But yes, this is something that that the militaries are concerned about and are acting on these issues, but on a very case by case basis. When it comes to geopolitical entanglements, of course, climate change does affect, does really influence the cooperative arrangements, but also climate change is used as a tool as well. I mean, just to give as an example. There's been a lot of talk about recent, agreements that Australia has entered into, say, with some of the South Pacific islands like Tuvalu, which is seen as one of the major breakthroughs on climate migration. But it has come under, it has come under a lot of scrutiny as well. And, we've seen that Tuvalu is now saying that, our sovereignty cannot be affected. Even if you say, okay, 280 Tuvaluans can migrate to Australia every year, at what cost? Is it at the cost of Tuvalu sovereignty itself? And this is where historical issues, colonialism, the fact that, we've had another instance just a couple of days ago, Solomon Islands president also said that, Australia and New Zealand are being condescending to us. So, so this attitude where, you have clear geopolitical alignments being drawn, where China is sort of becoming a more favored partner among many countries in the Pacific Islands or in Southeast Asia, or for that matter, even in parts of South Asia, apart from India, which is, clearly having a border conflict with China, there's not such kind of enmity between China and other countries. So there's a clear line again drawn there, which does affect these issues in a big way. There are other issues which we can discuss because of the paucity of time. I'm not going into that. So last but not the least, I would just focus on the issue of norms. And I think why, we've said this, that climate security needs to be context specific, including what is the nature of military involvement that we need. Because again, we're talking about countries which has seen dictatorship, which has seen, military coups, very strained civil-military relations in much of these contexts. You don't want the military to be, doing much on climate, especially when the relations between the civil and the military domains is very strained. And I think that is very critical for, there are many examples to take from Southeast Asia, South Asia, etc. So, so that's one factor which needs to be understood. Knowledge from the grassroots level is something that is also, especially in this region, there's a lot of knowledge that exists at the grassroots level. But much of the climate security discussions that happen do not integrate any of that within these discussions, So the participatory approach, which is much required, if climate security is not able to, or the discussion on climate security is not able to protect the lives of the most marginalized communities, which it claims to, then, why are we having this discussion at all? I think, when we constantly say most vulnerable populations and everything, and I feel that that is possible only through a participatory engagement, and that is clearly lacking in most of the climate security discussions that I have been part of, whether it's Indo-Pacific or anywhere else for that matter. The other part which I just wanted to highlight was formal and informal. This is my last point. I know I'm over time. Yeah. Formal and informal practices. Why I say that is that a lot of countries engage with the idea or notions of climate security very informally. They may not have something written in paper. As an example, India does not have a national security strategy, does not have a formal one. The military, the joint doctrine of the Indian Armed Forces does mention environmental security, climate change, etc., but that's because of the military doctrine. Many countries similarly also follow this kind of informal ways of engaging with climate security for different reasons, again, because of some institutional reasons or historical reasons, etc. So I think it's also, when we look at the challenge of, standardization of practices, it's important to see which context are we really engaging with, where, the practices might be very different and very different ways of dealing with these issues. So I'll stop there, and thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you, Bruno, for arranging yesterday's viewing of the eclipse, because I think it's absolutely crucial to remind us of why we're all here. For the last many millennia, many millions of years, the planet's climate system has been controlled by celestial mechanics, of which we saw an extraordinary example yesterday. The way that planet moves, the way it relates to the sun, the way the orbital arrangements shift through time has, until very recently, been what has determined the Earth's climate. Yes, there have been amplification effects, principally driven by carbon dioxide, but the trigger mechanism, until very recently, has been precisely the orbital mechanics that we saw yesterday. And so it's really, really appropriate that this was an event that coincided with the eclipse, because that should remind us all of what is now different. What is now different is that it is no longer the orbital mechanics, the way the planet and the sun interact, that are actually determining the climate. We are determining the climate, and that is fundamentally new. It is a fundamental shift in the human condition, and we need to respond appropriately to these new circumstances. And so the reminder yesterday was perfect. Thank you for arranging it, Bruno.
All planned.
This morning we have heard about the March temperature records. We have been talking about planetary emergencies, and it seems to me that the obvious intellectual response, which has to spill into policy, has to be the need for rapid innovation. But it also has to be a circumstance in which we understand security requiring flexibility and adaptation. Is it still the case that the US Air Force has lost more F-22s to a hurricane than it has to combat? What was it, Tyndall base down in the Panhandle 4 or 5 years ago? We are dealing with a world in which we are clearly vulnerable in all sorts of ways that are accelerating and becoming more dangerous, but the flexibility of response would seem to be absolutely crucial in terms of security. The difficulties talking about this morning in terms of the long lead times, in terms of procurement for platforms, simply emphasizes the point that we are having to think about dynamic circumstances with a mode of response which locks us into things in the longer term. Because time matters in an emergency, and I think that we need to stop and think about, well, how do we respond flexibly? How might we think outside the traditional conflict climate box that Dhanasree has just emphasized? And what I've been thinking about for the last decade nearly now is how to link the celestial mechanics replacement problem down to the very practicalities that Lloyd was talking about this morning, in terms of how do you make the connection between the new planetary circumstances and the practicalities of how we operate. And it's come to me, because I think about security and geopolitics more than most do, that the mechanisms that we need to focus on are in some cases very complicated, but also very, very simple. To chemistry and physics, it seems to me that the chemistry of combustion is absolutely at the heart of this. It has profound geophysical consequences because it is in fact the processes of combustion that are causing climate change, and we should not lose track of that most basic chemical reaction which has all the geophysical consequences in terms of climate change. Firepower is at the heart of most discussions of military concerns. It's at the heart of most discussions of geopolitics. My argument now is it's also at the heart of climate change, because the power that fire gives us is, of course, the power that powers our societies, our buildings, our vehicles, our whole society. 80% of the energy that we use comes from combustion, and it's the emissions from that combustion that are what are now changing the climate in a way that previously celestial mechanics used to do so. It's worth restating that because it is the profound context in which all other things therefore follow. How does this connect in terms of global security, or, as I said yesterday, planetary security? Well, in terms of the practical materiality of this, the processes that we are using for combustion are literally changing rocks into air. Stop and think about it. That is what combusting fossil fuels is actually doing. We are a planetary shaping force because we are literally turning rocks into air. And there has never been a process on planet Earth that has done that before on anything like the scale. Yes, there have been burnings of fossil fuels in the past by volcanic action and various other things, but nothing on anything like the planetary scale that is currently happening. And the reason that we're in a crisis mode is that this is what this strange bipedal mammalian species has been doing on an extraordinary scale and an accelerating scale over the last few decades. Firepower would seem to be something that needs to be constrained in a more secure world if we're thinking about common security or comprehensive security. And here, of course, one of the other things that the militaries of the last few decades have been grappling with is arms control. How do you actually control fire in the military sense, particularly nuclear weapons, which would be so devastating should they be actually detonated in war? And guess what? The folks that are busy looking at the climate change discussion, the absence of effective response in the Paris Agreement and emissions control, have over the last few years begun to stop and think about how we might do something differently. And yes, there are proposals now for non-proliferation treaty-type arrangements to constrain the production of fossil fuels in the same way as non-proliferation arrangements were negotiated over the past century to try and reduce the production of dangerous weapons systems. The parallels would seem to be fairly obvious in terms of what it is that might usefully be contributed by the security sector. It turns out that emissions are incredibly difficult to track and to count, to the discussion this morning about the lack of data on this. It's a heck of a lot easier to count tankers, refineries, pipelines. Those are things you can spot from satellites. National technical means are an obvious parallel from the Cold War in terms of tracking and monitoring the production and use of fuel. And it might well be that the parallel practices from arms control would nicely translate into practical efforts to monitor the production, use, and distribution of fossil fuels, which are, of course, at the heart of the climate crisis. So there's a different way, I'm thinking here, that the security sector might actually begin to grapple with the proliferation of fossil fuels, because, of course, it's precisely the proliferation of fossil fuels that is at the heart of all of our crisis discussions. Yes, that will require that the security sector get serious policy thinkers to be aware of the common dangers that the continued use of fossil fuels present to most societies on our planet. But then again, that was, of course, precisely the point about arms control in the Cold War. The common danger of mutual destruction was what triggered in the 80s serious discussions about nuclear disarmament and has emphasized the importance of the non-proliferation nuclear arms regime. There's a parallel directly here, because, of course, if we continue to use fossil fuels, we continue to produce them on the scale we have been doing, we are heading for assured destruction of another sort, like the one that would have happened if we had had a major nuclear exchange in the 1980s. Mutual, perhaps, it doesn't work quite as well, but it is certainly assured destruction. We need to confront, indelicate though it may be, that nasty little four-letter word, the one that begins with FU. Fuel is the problem. And focusing on how it is we constrain the production and use of fuel suggests a whole series of mindsets that work in the security sector in ways that might get us some other policy handles on the issue. It might also, to Lloyd's point this morning, actually relate the global strategic stuff to the very practical, doing it on the ground stuff that is a crucial part of making it real for operatives in various military forces. But it seems to me that facing a similar situation to mutually assured destruction from the Cold War, in terms of the non-proliferation of fuels, we really do need to stop and think that in terms of climate security, the priority somehow or other is to convince policymakers that their task is to figure out how to share a crowded world rather than continue to play the Cold War and the revived geopolitical games of trying to dominate a divided one. Because we're all in one Earth system, and the commonalities of vulnerabilities may be somewhat geographically various, but we only have one Earth, and figuring out how to share it has to be the top priority for any kind of planetary security that is now going to make sense going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone.